All right, guys. Well, we are live here at Framing the World. I really appreciate you guys tuning into today's program. It's going to be a good stream today. We are going to be talking with Alex Newman. For those of you who don't know who he is, Alex is an award winning international journalist, educator, author, speaker, investor, and consultant who seeks to glorify God in everything he does. He is also one of the main people that we interviewed for our Covidland series. So I really appreciate Alex's perspective on a lot of these things. If you guys haven't really heard of him, make sure you check him out at his website, libertysentinel.org. And of course, check out the Covidland series if you haven't watched that. It is a fantastic series. He is featured heavily in the episode 2, Covidland, The Mask. Well, how are you doing today, Alex?
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much for having me, Paul. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you.
Well, I really wanted to talk about homeschooling today. It's a topic that I'm very passionate about. I actually want to make a movie on this someday. I have a lot of different ideas, but someday I do want to make a movie on education. I know that you have this is one of your main passions in what you do. Can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, well, I appreciate it, Paul. Thank you. And education really is one of my passions, partly because I believe it is the single most critical issue in this fight that we find ourselves in as a nation, as families, as a church. We're facing war on all sides. We're surrounded by the enemy. And I would argue that their primary weapon in this war against our children, against our families, against our country, our constitution, the values that we hold dear, is the public school system. So I've been very passionate about this for over a decade. Co-wrote a book with the great Dr. Sam Blumenfeld, Crimes of the Educators, How Utopians Are Using Government Schools to Destroy America's Children. Um, Sold very well. Dr. Sam Blumenfeld spent over 60 years of his life investigating the education system, looking at the origins, the history, the quackery that was being used to dumb down our people, especially the reading quackery, what passes for literacy instruction, literally designed to turn your children into illiterates and handicap them in reading for the rest of their lives. So I've been very passionate about this for a long time. I got another education book coming out very soon. Our working title now is Indoctrinating Our Children to Death. I expect we'll have that released within a month or two. And I've been not just passionate about education, I've been deeply involved in it as well. I taught advanced economics to high school seniors for 12 years. I now serve on the board of the classical Christian school that I was teaching at for 12 years. It's called Freedom Project Academy. And I believe if we deal with the education crisis that we're facing, the other problems will take care of themselves, right? Families will stop collapsing. The people will demand that the border be shut down. The government will return to its proper constitutional bounds. But if we don't deal with the education crisis, if we don't deal with the weaponization, the dumbing down, the sexualization of our children, all the other stuff we're doing is totally in vain. I mean, you may be able to elect enough decent political leaders to hold back the tsunami for another year or another 5 years. I don't know, but at some point it's going to be all over. So I believe we need to go to the Bible for insights into what legitimate, real education looks like, and it's essentially the opposite of what passes for education in the public schools today.
Well, I just recently checked out your website that I had no idea about, publicschoolexit.com, which I was looking at today, and it is a fantastic website. Tell us a little bit about that website.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. So there's a long and pretty cool story behind this. In 2019, I bought a camper, a travel trailer, hitched it to the back of my Toyota truck, and loaded the kids and the wife in the truck, and we drove across the country almost 5 months. So we stopped in 45 states. I think I gave 150 speeches across the United States and in several other countries. And out of that grew this ministry called Public School Exit. I'm the executive director, which sounds fancy. I'm really just a volunteer. I don't draw a paycheck. We do have some paid staff in California who answer phones and deal with emails and put out our newsletter and stuff. But our goal really is to support families and to support churches in this. Public School Exit really is the name of the ministry, and it's our mission. We need children, especially Christian children, to exit the public school system. For me, that's one of the top priorities in my life, is to expose this evil system that has developed and to rescue children from it. So the ministry does a lot of work. We partner with churches and families across the United States, even around the world. And our goal is to knock down every possible barrier to churches and to families for getting children out of the public schools. And if you look at the data, it's absolutely atrocious. I serve on the advisory board of the Nehemiah Institute. Their best data, after studying worldview for decades and decades, shows that something on the order of 80 to 90% of Christian children from Christian homes are going to leave the church and leave the faith after 12 years of indoctrination. That's totally unacceptable. People talk about the Great Commission. Oh, we don't want to talk about education in our church. We just do the Great Commission. Oh, you're going to make disciples of all nations. You're going to teach them to obey all the things that God has commanded you. And at the same time, you're going to lose 80 to 90% of the children in your congregation. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense right there. So, I don't mean to be rude or flippant, but we really are facing a monumental crisis. The federal government's own data shows that less than 1/3 of the victims of government schools are even proficient in any core subject: reading, writing, math, science, history, whatever. And that's based on their most dumbed down standards we've ever had in this country. Something like less than half of American adults, according to federal literacy surveys, are functionally illiterate. So we have a monumental crisis. Our country's not going to survive. Our freedoms are not going to survive, Paul, if we don't deal with this. So that's why we formed the ministry. Lots of free resources there. We do free consultation calls every Friday for parents or churches, pastors who want to get connected and want some help. We've got an amazing board of directors and advisors. I'll give you an example. I stopped in Phoenix, Arizona, to give a talk on that national speaking tour I did. And one of the folks in the audience was the state superintendent of public schools for Arizona, a wonderful lady, Diane Douglas. And so we talked afterwards. She's like, you know what, you're right. The public schools cannot be saved. We just need to get the children out. So she's now working very closely with us. We've got Diane Davis of Alethea Christian College. She's training folks all across the country to start one-room schoolhouses. We've got Brad Dacus, the head of the Pacific Justice Institute, one of the best lawyers in this country, battling for religious freedom, battling for our children. We've got Dr. Duke Pesta, Paul Blair, Pastor Paul Blair, the head of Reclaiming America for Christ and the Liberty Pastors Network. Dran Reese, of course, is the head of Salt and Light Ministries. They've got Salt and Light Ministries in churches all across the country. We've got E. Ray Moore, one of the kind of godfathers of the movement. He's with the Exodus Mandate. So we really do have just unbelievable leaders in the education realm, in the church realm, ministry, law, you name it. We brought together the best experts out there to be a support to the church and to families that, on this just absolutely existential crisis that we're facing, Paul.
Well, God has given us a real responsibility to train our children. One of the verses that I love is in Proverbs 22, where it says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." And it feels like we have just really dropped the ball as Americans in training our children in the last 100 years. And so I wanted to talk to you about this crisis that's happening in our education system. Today, only 6.73% of children from K through 12 are homeschooled. And if you break that down into primary students, it's only 3 to 4% of those children are homeschooled in America, which is wild to me, especially with all the indoctrination that is happening in the public schools today. Why aren't more parents taking responsibility in educating their children today?
It's a very good question, Paul. It's a very, very good question, especially considering what the Bible says about education, especially considering the absolute horror show, the dumpster fire that the public schools have become. And I would say a few things. There's very good news on this front. The number of families fleeing the government's indoctrination system is rapidly growing. During COVID, for example, we saw almost a doubling of the homeschool population, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. They said that the number of families with school-aged children who were homeschooling, genuine homeschooling, not government school at home, increased from about 6% to about 12%. In the Black community, that went from 3% to 16%. So we are seeing an exodus. Unfortunately, some of those families did go back to the government indoctrination system after, at least peak lunacy when it came to COVID. But we are seeing some very, very important trends, Paul. When I first started telling people 10 years ago that you need to get your children out of government schools, that was seen as really, really radical. Today, it's almost common wisdom among conservatives and Christians, especially conservative and evangelical Christians. So we're making progress on this front in terms of public opinion. Public schools have never been less trusted and less popular than they are today. The teachers unions are in a panic. A lot of school districts have lost 10, 15, 20% of their victims. Just in the last few years, they're having to sell off property. They're having to get rid of teachers. And so this is all encouraging. Obviously, it's not enough. Right? I tell parents, like, if the building were on fire and your children were inside screaming for help, you would be an absolute maniac to say, well, I think I'm going to run for school board. I think I'm going to circulate a petition and see if we can get my state legislators to do something. And the reality is the situation is much more urgent than a fire. This is much worse than a burning building, because a fire may hurt your children physically. What's happening here is not just physical harm. I mean, they're literally castrating boys. They're literally giving hysterectomies to girls. They're removing breasts from girls. They are perpetrating abortions on little girls without parental consent. You've got beatings and gang activity and school shootings and suicide and drug abuse. I mean, the schools are just a war zone. But so, physical harm is bad enough. But when you add that, you compound the problem with the spiritual devastation, the academic, the moral, the just devastation on every front. It's amazing that there's still anybody left willing to put their children in these meat grinders. I think the short answer to your question is, one, there's a tremendous amount of ignorance. A lot of people don't know how bad the situation is, and a lot of people don't know what the Word of God says. And that, of course, is partly because they're not reading their Bibles, and partly because their pastor is not preaching the whole counsel of God. So there's a lot of blame to go around here. And I think it's partly financial. Americans have become accustomed to a very high standard of living. You hear a lot of people say, well, we can't afford to educate our children. We can't afford to pay for a private school. And you think, oh, that's interesting. You've got a 2021 BMW out there. You've got a vacation home in Colorado. You're taking 2 weeks out of the year to go to the Caribbean or to Disney World or whatever. But you don't have money to educate your children. Actually, this is a matter of priorities, right? We live in the wealthiest society that humanity has ever produced. If our goat herding ancestors 2,000 years ago could homeschool their children, we can certainly do it as well. It's just a matter of priorities. And a lot of people haven't realized how urgent this situation is. They may have, fond memories of their own time in a government brainwash camp. Maybe they remember the football or, the prom or whatever it was. And they don't realize that things have deteriorated to such an extent now where their children, their family, and their country are at risk if this continues. So we have a big task before us, Paul, and that begins by shining the light on this evil and showing people what the Bible says. We've got a lot of work to do, but we're doing it, and we intend to continue doing it.
Give us a little history, Alex, on when government became involved in educating our children.
It really is a fascinating story, Paul. I wish more people knew about it. And this is one of the things that I'm really going to address in my upcoming book that'll be coming out just in a month or two. And I believe if this story were more widely known, Christians would have no option but to flee the system. And so there was a little bit of experimentation with government education back in ancient Greece. The Spartans tried it. They wanted to raise up, unquestioning soldiers who would just do whatever they were ordered to do. So Sparta tried that, fascist Sparta. Didn't work out very well. But in the contemporary era, this actually began in the early 1800s with Robert Owen, is where the story starts. Robert Owen is a name that's been largely forgotten to history today, and yet he continues to haunt our country and the world from the grave. He was a communist before communism was even a thing, even before Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto. He wanted to get rid of private property. He wanted to dismantle the family and create a kind of a collectivist utopia where we would all work together for the common good, which sounds so cute unless you realize that the heart is desperately wicked, as the Bible says, and that the institution of private property is divinely ordained. The institution of family is divinely ordained. And when you try to go against that, things go south quickly. So he started this commune called New Harmony in Indiana. Total failure, right? It didn't even last 2 years. It was a total disgrace, a total disaster. And he came to the conclusion that the reason it failed was because these children had been educated and raised in kind of a Christian, what he considered to be an individualistic society with excessive focus on individual rights and the individual versus the collective. And so he wrote these essays on the formation of human character. He wrote these very bizarre essays. At the time, totally unhinged. Nobody really took this stuff seriously, arguing that the government ought to educate children. This was inconceivable to most Americans at that time. The closest thing we ever had to kind of a government school system, the Puritans and Pilgrims in Massachusetts, said that churches needed to make sure that all the children could read so that they could read their Bible so that Satan wouldn't deceive them, right? And some very dishonest and ignorant people try to claim that was the genesis of the public school system. Nothing could be further from the truth. So you have that idea, but the modern system really began with Robert Owen. So this didn't take off in America, but actually these essays that he wrote got picked up by the ambassador to Prussia, took him back to the Prussian dictator, who was still smarting after losing a war to Napoleon. And he thought, hey, this would be a good idea. In fact, Robert Owen wrote in his autobiography that the Prussian dictator so much approved of these crazy government education ideas that he ordered his interior minister to set up a government school system modeled on his essays. The first time ever that we had education of the state, by the state, and for the state. Another thing that Robert Owen did, and we know of this because one of the members of this defected and blew the whistle, but he created what was described by this whistleblower named Orestes Brownson, a secret society modeled on the Carbonari in Europe. And the two immediate goals, according to the whistleblower, Orestes Brownson, he became a Catholic and he repented of this evil he had participated in and tried to expose it, and did expose it. A lot of what we know about the secret society comes from Orestes Brownson. And he said that the two immediate goals were to shift public opinion, to try to convince people that government should be involved in education, and also to get men elected to the legislature who would support this crazy idea. Now, Americans had no need for this, no interest in this. We were the best educated people who had ever walked on the planet. We had almost universal literacy across most of our major cities, and even out in the rural areas. Americans were unbelievably educated at this time before government got involved in education. And according to Orestes Brownson, the great object of this movement, this secret society that Robert Owen launched, was, and I'm quoting, to get rid of Christianity. And he said, we weren't going to come out and say that openly. It was the long-term objective. But Robert Owen understood that the big obstacle to his utopian society with no family and no property was Christianity. And he was probably right. Okay, so they went to war, and by nature, secret societies are very difficult to track. But what we do know is that Horace Mann loved the system that the Prussian dictator had set up, and he wanted to import it to Massachusetts. He actually went over to Prussia to study this system for a time, and came back with these glowing reports of how wonderful it was, and what obedient little, unbelievable. He believed that we could get rid of 90% of the crime if we just had the government educating students. And so he got himself selected by the Massachusetts legislature as the first ever Secretary of Education. There had never been a Secretary of Education in any state. Right? The idea, again, was pretty much inconceivable to early Americans. But so Horace Mann gets himself elected or selected by the legislature as Secretary of Education. He imports the Prussian model into Massachusetts. They set up government schools. They set up teacher training camps. They call them normal schools, to train teachers so that all the teachers will fan out and teach what the government wants taught. He wanted to get the Bible out of schools, which, that again was inconceivable during that era. That was the primary textbook that everybody used. It was totally ridiculous. He wanted the public schools to equalize all men, and the quackery just started rushing in to this new system, Paul. Phrenology, for example, was one of Horace Mann's ideas. The idea that you can measure somebody's skull and determine their personality and who they're. Total quackery. Everybody knows it's pseudoscience today, but that was a big thing for him. And also the whole word method of teaching reading, which had been developed for deaf children to learn how to read. Horace Mann tried it out in his public schools on non-deaf children. It was a total disaster. The schoolmasters came together and debunked that. But after Horace Mann was done in Massachusetts, he traveled the country like an evangelist, preaching the good news of salvation by government education. And so he went to legislatures all over the country and said, hey, you guys really need to set up a government school system. You should see how great it's working in Massachusetts, where, getting rid of crime and everybody's so highly, it was all a lie, of course, but legislators bought into this stuff. And so by the time 1900 came along, a lot of the states had set up government school systems. A lot of the states had passed compulsory education laws requiring parents to hand their children over to these government indoctrination centers. And it was a process, right? The government school system in 1900 didn't look like it does today. Maybe they went to school for a month a year, maybe a month and a half, maybe on a few weekends just to do some basics. It wasn't like today where 9 months, 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, you're sitting in a government school classroom learning about transgenderism and climate change. But it was a process. And then there's one more guy I'll talk about. I know I'm kind of going on here, but I want to try to get this in because it's so important for people to understand. Along comes John Dewey. There's another guy who rejected the Bible, another guy who rejected the moral principles that God laid down in the Bible. And he, unsurprisingly, was a big fan of the Soviet Union. He actually went to the Soviet Union and wrote back these absolutely insane essays that were published by the New Republic. You can still read them today about what a glorious and wonderful system the Soviets were building. He especially loved their government schools that he said were instilling a collectivistic mentality in the children. So he was a communist, although not a revolutionary communist. He believed in a gradual approach to socialism, primarily through indoctrinating and dumbing down the population rather than an armed revolution to throw off the bourgeoisie. So that was him. He got himself selected as the honorary life president of the National Education Association. He teamed up with the Rockefellers, interestingly, right? Communists and super capitalists teamed up together. They set up an experimental school at the University of Chicago, dumbed down a bunch of kids who graduated, couldn't read, couldn't write, couldn't do math, couldn't tell right from wrong. That will be perfect, right? They actually resurrected the whole word quackery from Horace Mann. Then he went over to Teachers College at Columbia University, the most important teachers college in America. And from there, injected his poison in all the schools, all the public schools, all across the country that were then developing. He also wanted to use the public schools to propagate his false religion. He was one of the authors of the Humanist Manifesto, which people should read it. It's very blatant. The very first tenet is we believe the universe is self-existing and not created. Right, as compared and contrasted with God's word. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And as you read it, it's just communism. We got to get rid of the profit motive. We've got to change the structure of the ownership of the means of life. Right? So just communism and false religion. Of course, it's actually the oldest false religion in the book. Right, go back to Genesis chapter 3. Ye shall be as gods. Right. So John Dewey and his buddies thought, we'll be God because there is no real God. So we'll be God. Obviously, there's important political implications to this, and our founding fathers said it was a self-evident truth that God created us. So this idea that the schools would then indoctrinate the children into collectivism, dumb them down, propagate this false religion. 1962-63, the Supreme Court establishes this false religion from hell as the national religion of the United States by banning Bible, banning prayer in the public schools. And of course, it gets progressively worse, right? By the 60s, the federal government's now playing a role in education by funding stuff. And of course, the Supreme Court rulings dictating what can and can't be taught in the schools. And, that leads almost inevitably to today, where we're reaping the whirlwind, we're collecting the fruit from this horror show that we allowed to get started. And, the fruit is around us. Children killing themselves, children killing each other, children taking heroin. Children ready to burn down the country, children hate their parents, children who are revolutionaries and don't know what bathroom to go in. This is the inevitable consequence of us handing our children over to government, which really, if you read your Bible, never should have had any role in education at all.
It really has been like the frog in boiling water. I know when I was a kid, it was pretty bad, but it wasn't terrible. I did go to a small town school, so it wasn't as bad as probably the bigger towns. But today, I mean, it is out of control with the atheism, evolution, all the transgender stuff. I mean, the elites really did know how to do it. It's been slow progression over the years to get us to where we're at. And now, I mean, you really can't say that the public school is failing because they are doing a really good job at brainwashing everyone. And they know you got to start from when they're young. And then once you do that, a couple generations, you can really take over everything.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I think parents really need to understand, because you hear this almost constantly now. You can't turn on the TV anymore without hearing some conservative commentator say, the schools are failing. The schools are failing our children. The schools are broken. Like, no, 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 you're totally misunderstanding this. They're working very, very well. They're turning 80 to 90% of the children against the faith of their forefathers. They're dumbing them down at a level we have never seen before in human history. They're indoctrinating them into weird sex stuff and paganism and humanism. And the only ones who really slip through the cracks are the kids like me who don't pay any attention to class and the spitting spitballs and getting kicked out of school. It's really the only ones these days who are slipping through the cracks. The ones who are actually diligent and try to study and try to learn from the teacher, they end up just devastated morally, academically, spiritually, and in every possible way. It is such a monstrous crime being perpetrated against our children. I do believe the ringleaders of this system ought to be arrested and put on trial.
Absolutely. I want you to talk about real quick about how the future is of homeschooling because I know I personally have six kids. I'm going to have my seventh one here in early next year, and
Oh,
so
congratulations, man.
yeah, and so this topic is very important to me. My wife, uh, homeschools the children, and it's really not as hard as people might think to do it, but I do believe that they're going to start persecuting homeschoolers. It hasn't really started yet. I mean, there is some cases in which they have persecuted homeschoolers, but I really believe that eventually they will start persecuting homeschoolers like they are in other countries around the world. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's no doubt about it, Paul. And I'm so glad to hear that you have another one on the way. God said, be fruitful and multiply, which is exactly the opposite of what the government brainwash camps are teaching children today. And I'm so glad to hear that you and your wife are homeschooling. Me and my wife do as well. We've got 5, and Lord willing, someday we'll have more. I wouldn't trade it for the world, but you're absolutely right. They are going to crack down. I think there was a sense among the educational establishment for a while that, you know what, it's fine. Let this, 5-10% of families that are going to be at every school board meeting, complaining about what we're doing to their kids, just let them go do their own thing. We'll circle back and get them later. And we're rapidly approaching that later. I tell people kind of half jokingly that I just recently got back from the future. Spent many years living in Sweden, not on purpose. My wife is from there, so that's how we got connected to Sweden. But I actually watched the process. It was horrific, and I think it provides very, very valuable insight and intelligence for Americans as to what is coming. And so, I'll start the story in Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler became the first leader ever to criminalize homeschooling, to make it a crime for parents to educate their own children at home. Nobody had ever even thought to, not even Joseph Stalin. Made it a crime. They may have persecuted you, but they didn't officially make it a crime to educate your children at home. Adolf Hitler did. And after the denazification program, my grandpa was actually over as part of the occupation. They were denazifying Germany. They were removing Nazis from important positions of power. Many of them were being prosecuted for war crimes, and Nazi laws were being scrubbed from the books. One that didn't come down was the ban on homeschooling. And that remains in force today. They ruthlessly persecute homeschool families. They kidnap the children. They terrorize these kids. They bust in with, guns drawn and battering rams, and they drag these poor little kids out kicking and screaming. They take the parents off to jail. I mean, it's like stuff you would expect to see in North Korea, right? I mean, it's just barbarism, savagery writ large. And the German state does this very openly. The courts support them in this. And that has been true going clear back to Adolf Hitler. Well, more and more governments are now following in the footsteps of Adolf Hitler. And so I was in Sweden when the Swedish government decided to follow in the footsteps of Adolf Hitler. The parliament banned home education. This was about 11 years ago now. We were there. I was living there. Our first son had already been born. We had another on the way. And it was a horror show. One day homeschooling was legal. The next day it wasn't. They went to kidnap children. One of the most horrific stories. And, I got deeply involved in this. I reported on this story for at least 6 or 7 publications around the world, including some major magazines and newspapers. Was the story of Dominique Johansson. So this was a homeschooled child. I believe he was 7 or 8 years old when this was happening. And the government said, no, you can't homeschool. So the family said, okay, the mom was from India. They said, all right, we're just going to move to India then. We're not giving you our child. That's the end of that story. So they got on a plane. They boarded a Turkish Airlines flight to Istanbul. They were going to go from there then to India. And the government sent armed police on that airplane to grab this child before it could leave the gate. They dragged this boy off the airplane, kicking and screaming. The parents obviously followed, and that child was removed from his home. They actually wrote on the reasons why they were stealing him from his parents, homeschooling. And then later they added, like, well, he didn't have all his vaccines, and he had a cavity. And the parents were like, yeah, we were going to get the cavity taken care of with a dentist in India who happens to be part of our family. So that was some of the most horrific stuff I had ever seen. On the right side, other than the children that they kidnapped, the Swedish government didn't get any additional victims for its government indoctrination programs. The homeschool families either fled overseas or went underground. I actually marched through downtown Stockholm. There was maybe 100 families, maybe a little less, through downtown Stockholm. Fascinating story. So they were carrying signs, we're being persecuted, we don't want to leave, but we're being forced to. They stopped at the education ministry. The education minister, Jan Björklund, I think it was his name, supposedly with the Liberal Party, which was supposed to be the Freedom Party. He was the one responsible for this. He wouldn't even come down to meet them, look them in the eye, crying families, worried about losing their children. So they went down to the port, they got on a ship, and they sailed to an island called Åland in the Baltic Sea. It's technically Finnish, but they speak Swedish there. And actually, the Finnish education minister met them when they arrived and said, welcome to Finland. In Finland, it's in the Constitution, parents are to oversee the education and the upbringing of their children. So we're happy to have you settle in. Thank you for coming. And so that was an incredible story. But the reason I share all this is because I watched the process of how this happened, Paul, and we're watching it now happen in the United States too. And unfortunately, a lot of conservatives and Christians are helping to lead us into a crisis just like happened in Sweden. And I don't mean that to be mean or rude or controversial, but the reality is the way they did it in Sweden before they actually banned homeschooling and conscripted all the private schools into the government system was they started offering government money to private schools and Christian schools and non-state education providers. And then that's when it was like the cheese in the mousetrap, right? Free money. Woo! And so, all the private schools, they came and they get the free money, and then the trap closed. And they said, anybody who's taking this government money is now going to teach the government curriculum, which, makes California look sane by comparison. No more Bibles, no more prayer, right? None of that stuff. Jews, you can't do your own thing either. You got to be part of the government system. So we're now watching that happen in the United States. And UNESCO, the UN education agency, they actually put out a report, the Global Education Monitoring Report last year. It might have been 2021 now. And they actually call on governments around the world to start giving tax money to private schools and non-state education providers. And the reason why, and they say this clearly in the report, I've written about it for several publications now, they say that we want you to be able to impose equity goals on these providers. We want you to be able to impose national testing requirements on these providers. We want you to impose non-discrimination requirements in admissions and hiring on these providers. So, you don't want to hire a guy wearing a dress and some demon horns to teach your kindergarten students. Why not? It's discriminatory. So you have to, right? So now this is happening across the country, Paul, where Republican states, unfortunately, are saying, hey, we'll take money from your neighbor so that you can have money to homeschool your child, or so that you can send your child to a private school. And a lot of well-meaning, but unfortunately naive conservatives are jumping on the bandwagon. And it's just like the cheese in the mousetrap, just like in Sweden. The reason the mouse gets his head bashed in is because he doesn't understand why there's free cheese just sitting there. Well, folks, there's never a such thing as a free lunch. And so I believe the biggest threat to, we've got a lot of cranks and kooks that are openly advocating for banning homeschooling. We've got, for example, Elizabeth Bartholet at Harvard University's law school. She's part of the Child Advocacy Project. She's now trying to lay the legal groundwork for banning homeschooling. She put an article in the Arizona Law Review calling for a presumptive ban on home education. Her sidekick, James Dwyer at William and Mary, pushing for the same thing. So they're trying to make a legal argument that homeschooling is unacceptable. It's something that white supremacists and Nazis and child abusers do. So prepare to see a whole lot more of that. We're going to see an escalating propaganda campaign against homeschoolers as they prepare to start passing laws restricting and then eliminating homeschooling. But in the meantime, I think the biggest threat right now is the risk of government money. A lot of new homeschoolers, a lot of people who haven't thought through the consequences of this are putting their hand out, taking government money, whether it's Florida or Arizona or Utah or whatever, Oklahoma. A lot of these Republican states are doing this. And beware, folks, there is no such thing as a free lunch. And I believe as parents, we need to say, I as a dad, I as a mom, we are responsible for educating our children, not the government. And we need to steer clear of that. And we need to be prepared for the assault that's coming, because it's coming. I don't know when. It might be next year, it might be 10 years from now, but it's coming, and we need to be prepared.
What do you say to those parents out there that want to do homeschooling? Their student, I mean, their kid is in the public school right now. They want to do homeschooling, but they just don't know where to start. What would you recommend for them?
I'd say the building's on fire. Don't worry about where to start. Get your child out of the fire before you lose him or her, right? So that'd be my first piece of advice, Paul. And I don't mean to sound callous or flippant, but I do believe it's that urgent. You don't worry about where you're going to flee to when you're running from a burning building.
Yeah.
You just grab the child and you run. From there, then I can give some more advice. There's a lot of places you can start. And I would start off by saying, and I only say this half jokingly, like, you can put your kid in a closet for 12 years. It'd be better than a government school education, so-called, because at least the closet's not designed to destroy them. And again, I'm joking here, but the point is the same. The schools are designed to destroy your child. So you cannot possibly do worse than that. So don't fear, don't worry about it. Just get started, and don't try to do public school at home, right? That's a mistake that I think a lot of people do. They think, well, let's look at the Common Core standards. What should my child be doing now, halfway through 7th grade? No, throw that trash in the trash where it belongs. What is my child interested in? What are my child's strengths? What are his or her weaknesses? Now, there's a lot of different ways to do it, and every homeschool family is different. But one thing I would say for sure, you want to get together with a community of homeschoolers. You don't need to do this by yourself, and you don't want to do this by yourself. You want to be in community. So if you're a Christian, find a Christian co-op. If you're not a Christian, there are some secular co-ops as well. You should read your Bible, important. But anyways, find a co-op that kind of lines up with your interests, with your goals. Get your children plugged into that. Maybe it's 1 day a week, maybe it's 2 days a week. And that's a good place to start, is connect with other homeschoolers in your community. And you can get books from them, you can get ideas from them, you can get help from them. It's a good way for your children to be connected with other children, and have friends and all that kind of stuff. So that's really important. When it comes to curriculum, there's never been a better time to homeschool. There are so many resources out there. You don't even know where to start. I recommend go to your state homeschool convention. You'll meet all kinds of vendors. You'll meet all kinds of parents. You'll meet textbook providers, curriculum providers. Some parents, they want a whole curriculum out of the box, right? They want to just, here's $1,000, give me every book that I'm going to need, give me every worksheet I'm going to need, give me instructions for me as the parent teacher. I just want everything done for me. Other family, what we do in our homeschool at home, we mix and match. We use one math curriculum for one child, a different math curriculum for another child. Maybe we'll take a history book that we like and use it with the 7-year-old, and we'll do a different one. So, it's a little bit more complicated that way, to mix and match and find resources that you like and that are most suited for each individual child. But there's no really wrong way to homeschool. What I would say is just don't try to replicate government school at home. Talk to your child, see what he or she is interested in, find out what are they good at, what do they need extra help at, and just recognize your child is unique. Your child was made unique by God, and so customize his or her education based on their interests, their passions, their strengths, their weaknesses. And we got a lot of good resources at publicschoolexit.com. If you don't feel comfortable maybe teaching Latin or chemistry or foreign language, I'm, like I said earlier, I'm on the board of the Freedom Project Academy. You can find us at fpeusa.com or .org, and you can kind of pick classes a la carte. You don't have to take the full curriculum, but one place that I would definitely say is important to start. You want to look up the laws in your state. I do advocate, as the Bible says, as much as you possibly can. You want to obey the government. If the government says, you got to fill out this form, or you got to do this, that, or the other, you got to let the school know. Unless you have some very, very compelling reason not to, I generally recommend complying with that. You probably also want to join your Homeschool Legal Defense Association and your state organization. They can provide you with legal support, with guidance if you need it. So look up the laws in your state. Some states, very simple. You don't even have to tell the government anything. anything. You just stop sending your kids to school and you're good. Other states like Massachusetts, much more complicated. You're going to have to get approval. You're going to have to consider testing requirements, things like that. So look up the laws, connect with the community, join some of these associations so that you have backup if and when the need should arise. And then pick materials, resources, curricula, textbooks that your children enjoy, that are going to teach them what they need to learn. And again, you cannot do a worse job than the public schools. So be encouraged, be confident. Nobody loves your children more than you do. You can do an excellent job, even if you don't have a high school diploma.
Right, and it's not as hard as a lot of people think. It's fairly simple, and you can make it hard, and you can make it easy. I mean, you can go wherever you feel comfortable doing it is where you can kind of land in your training of your children. And so I feel like people just need to just do it because the public school is lost. I mean, it is crazy the all the different things that are coming out of there now, and you're going to lose your child. I mean, the odds of you losing your child to this woke agenda is extremely high. And then you have to live with that child for the rest of your life and deal with them being an idiot the rest of your life. So I really encourage you guys to please do research on this and make that decision to homeschool your child.
Yeah, I do believe, Paul, that this is the most important issue facing us as individuals, as families, as churches, as communities, and as a nation. If we fail here, we're going to lose on every other front. There's no way we're going to get a secure border. There's no way we're going to shrink the size and scope of government. There's no way we're going to stop the slaughter of unborn babies. There's no way we're going to turn this ship around. And so it is just absolutely critical that people understand this. And I'm very glad to hear what you said right now. Parents, when I hear I can't afford to homeschool my child, I can't afford to get them a good education, I'm telling you, you can't afford not to. The heartache, the heartbreak that you're going to experience if you do not deal with this is incalculable. There's no way to put a monetary value on what these pay. And I'll tell you what, yeah, I mentioned earlier, I traveled across the country speaking on this issue. I cannot tell you how many parents came up to me just sobbing, bawling after my talks. I didn't know. I've lost my kid. Now my kid hates me. My kid says I'm a fascist because I like Donald Trump. My kid says I'm a racist because I'm a Republican. My kid hates Christianity. My kid hates me. My kid is a transgender and chopped off his private parts. There are millions and millions and millions of moms and dads just like you who are dealing with this. And I think parents are telling themselves, well, that's other people's children. That's not going to happen to me. I'm raising them right. I'm debriefing them at dinner and making sure that they know that everything they're learning in school is a lie. Are you kidding me? That's what all these other moms and dads thought when they sent their children off to school. I can almost guarantee you're going to regret it. And you're going to think back to this conversation, to this podcast, to this interview 10 years from now, and you're going to say, oh man, I should have listened. I should have listened. Now I've lost my child or I've lost my children. They hate me. They won't talk to me. They've aborted my grandchildren. They're hooked on heroin. They've overdosed on fentanyl. Man, I wish I had just listened to Paul and Alex. Why wasn't I paying attention? Why was my vacation or my big fancy house or my nice new car more important to me than the well-being of my children? Folks, I cannot emphasize this strongly enough. Get up to speed on things. If you've got young children, make sure I mentioned briefly this controversy over the ways that reading is taught. Very, very simple. Get a phonics and make sure it's a legitimate phonics book. You can get Alpha Phonics produced by Dr. Sam Blumenfeld. You can get it on any bookstore. You can download it for free at campconstitution.net. That's where you start. You teach your kids how to read properly. You give them a good foundation, teach them to love education, teach them to love learning, and the rest kind of does itself, right? Once your child is passionate about learning, interested in learning, they will pretty much do the work themselves. You cannot go wrong with homeschooling or finding a good Christian school or a good co-op. And really, there's very little in life that will be more important. And I just want to add one more thing to this, and then I'll stop. We talked about the immediate consequences of losing your child, the heartbreak of having your family destroyed, your progeny destroyed. You're also going to give an account to God one day, right? These are God's children. God has entrusted them to you for a short time, 18 years, maybe 19, 20 if you're lucky. God is going to hold you accountable for that. You bear responsibility for what you do. And if you read your Bible, you will find out very quickly what God expects you to do. Go to Deuteronomy chapter 6, go to Deuteronomy chapter 11. Read what a proper education looks like. You should be diligently teaching your children about God when you wake up in the morning, when you go to sleep at night, when you're walking by the way, when you're sitting down to eat. You should be discipling your children at all times. Now, God gives us a lot of liberty, right? He doesn't tell us that you must have 43 credit hours of science and 57 of math. Right? You don't get into that kind of nitty gritty detail, but we do know some of the basics. Right? Go to Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7. Go to Proverbs chapter 9, verse 10. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. You and I both know there is no fear of the Lord being instilled in your children in a government school at all. If anything, they're mocking the Lord. They're laughing. They're ridiculing God and his word. They're ridiculing you. They're teaching your children that you're the enemy, that you are not a safe space. What happens if you have no fear of the Lord? You're not going to get any wisdom. You're not going to get any knowledge. And if you believe the government's own data, your kids aren't going to learn how to read. They're not going to learn how to do math. You must take this seriously, ladies and gentlemen. Get some resources, connect with others in your community, and get on this like your child's life depended on it, because it very well may.
Well, awesome. I really appreciate you coming on the program today, Alex, to talk about this. What was the name of your book that's going to be coming out in a month?
So my old one that I wrote with Dr. Sam Blumenfeld, that was Crimes of the Educators, How Utopians Are Using Government Schools to Destroy America's Children. The next one, which will be coming out soon, it's really going to get into the history of how we got here. I went through some of it here briefly. That's called, it's not official yet, but our working title is Indoctrinating Our Children to Death. The war on how the schools wage war on faith, family, and freedom, and what you can do to stop it.
Wow, that sounds awesome. This topic is so important because I love talking about anything like conspiracy related. I love talking about this stuff, but it all goes back to how our children, the next generation, we're really, to fight against all this evil that's happening in this world. We got to start there. We got to raise our children right, and so when they grow up, they can lead the next generation and teach. And the elites know this, and that's why they have been working so hard for the last 100 years to change the way society thinks, and it is working. Society is dumb as a box of rocks now, and they are just completely off the rails. And so we as Christians really need to, change what's happening. And so how can people support you, Alex, and find out more information about you?
Well, I appreciate that very much, Paul. Thank you. So my primary website is libertysentinel.org. If I'd realized that very few Americans can spell sentinel, I wouldn't have chosen that name. So it's Sentinel, and it's got to be .org. So libertysentinel.org is my main website. People can sign up for our free newsletter there. If they want to become paid subscribers, we offer some exclusive benefits for those who help us do our work. I'm senior editor at The New American Magazine. That's thenewamerican.com. We also do a print magazine. I encourage people to subscribe. Public School Exit is available at publicschoolexit.com. We do have a scholarship fund for children of very, very low income families who need some help getting out of the government school system. Again, I don't draw a salary there other than our paid staff. All the leadership is volunteers. We do this because we're passionate about this. And I'd encourage people to check out all those resources. If I can be of service to you, or if we can be of service to you somehow, please get in touch. And again, the best way to stay on top of the work that I'm doing, libertysentinel.org, and sign up for that free newsletter. Just put your email in. We won't sell it. We won't spam you. Generally, we're sending out about 2 per week. And, it doesn't just cover education. We deal with China, the United Nations, the border, all these different issues like you do, Paul. And we really appreciate the opportunity to serve all the great folks out there. So, and thank you for having me on, Paul.
Awesome. Well, it's just great to hear like-minded people talk about these issues. I really wish people would just, grab onto this information and really make it part of them. It's not as hard as parents think. It's not going to take up your full day to homeschool your kid. I mean, my kids, they are way smarter than the other kids their age. I mean, it's noticeably different. Not only the intellect, but they can sit still. They can do what they're told. Like it's you're raising your kids. They're done with school by usually like 1 o'clock. They're totally done, and that's taking their time with breaks and everything. So just guys, please look into this. Check out more of Alex's content, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, Alex. God bless.
Thank you, Paul. God bless you too.
All right, well, that was a fantastic interview with Alex Newman. Guys, support him. Head over to his store and check out more of his information. Make sure you definitely get those books. I'm going to get those books in my store. I feel like this topic is so important. And so, yeah, I gotta do that. I got to get these books in the store. But stay tuned, guys. We're going to have a couple more interviews scheduled, I think later this week, maybe next week. But thanks for tuning in, guys. God bless you. Have a great rest of your day, and see you later.